welcome to my Quickshotz video. How are you doing today? Great! Okay, just one thing. Let there be light! And there was light. Oh, it might be a bit too bright. Might have to play around with that for future vlogs. Anyway, right, so today I'm going to talk very briefly, hopefully, about tone curves in Lightroom. It's going to be a very basic introduction. Now, I've been doing vlogs for a little while now, but I've been watching them for much longer. And something that I've noticed actually from other vloggers, well, not all vloggers, but some vloggers who have edited images on screen or shown edited images on screen, but also shown their Lightroom settings. And in some cases, they've edited those images perhaps in a way which doesn't necessarily get the best out of the image, or doesn't give a natural feel to the image. I'm going to show you what I mean in a sec. Here we go. Right, so hopefully this is all working. Right, okay. Now, tone curves. Now, this image here is the Torre de Vagelet, or the Vagelet Towers, which you might recognize this image from my Alps vlog part 2. This is the final image that was edited. You'll note here that it's actually a pano, a stitched pano. It was stitched in Lightroom, and that's because I was using the 24mm tilt shift. When I use that lens, I always compose for the top and the bottom, and then I tend to shift the lens left and right to get 3 images which are then stitched together in Lightroom. It just gives me a slightly bigger image in terms of megapixels. And when I use other lenses, I tend to compose for the right and the left edge because those lenses don't lend themselves as well to panoramas. Anyway, so this is the final image, and now this, I didn't click, there we go. This is the original RAW, which is quite a flat file in terms of contrast and everything, which is typical for a RAW image. You'll notice that there's a guy stood in here and a couple of people here as well who were cloned out of the final image, as well as a few dust spots, etc. Right, now if I go over to I'm in the develop module, and if I go over to the editing suite over on the right hand side, you'll see at the top we've got the histogram, then we have the basic panel, and then the tone curve below. And what I tend to see, people have got their sliders all over the place here, like this, you know, whites up here and blah blah blah, and this line, the tone curve, remains untouched. Now, I think that's obviously because basic editing, it's very easy, but it's not necessarily the best way to go about editing your images. And one of the things that I get told quite a lot, or I receive opinions on, is that my images tend to be tonally quite natural, and that's, I think, because I use the tone curve rather than rely on these sliders. Now, a quick recap, if you're unfamiliar with the histogram, we've got our exposure here. You'll see that it's slightly to the left, slightly underexposed, and that's because I tend to underexpose my images in camera, because the camera I use, I can recover the shadows really well, and so I expose effectively for the highlights. So I don't have to do so much with the highlights. The histogram is broken into 5 sections. We're going to ignore the middle one, which is exposure. There are essentially 4 sections. There are whites, highlights, shadows, and blacks, and you'll notice as I scrolled across that each one of the sliders lit up. Now, if I play around with those sliders, if I pull down the highlights by 52%, 51%, what it's actually doing is it's attacking all of the highlight section by 51%. It's a linear reduction across the board, whether it's a bright highlight or a not so bright highlight. And that is the same for all of those 4 individual sliders there. Now the obvious one to look at is contrast. People want to add in more contrast immediately because a raw file tends to lack contrast. But you've got zero control over what you're actually adding contrast to. What you're actually adding contrast to is the whole image. So all the highlights, all the shadows, all the darks, all the whites. And there's no control over that. So what you end up with is quite a crunchy looking file. You then run into problems later on if you start to then play with highlights and shadows, but I'll talk about that a little bit more later in the vlog. Now, if you come down to the tone curve, you'll see that that's broken into 4 different sections as well: shadows, darks, lights, and highlights. And the histogram is represented here by this great histogram, which is representing the luminosity of the image. Now you can play around with the 3 individual color channels, red, green, and blue, tonally within the tone curve, but today I'm just dealing with the basic luminosity of the image. Now shadows, darks, lights, and highlights, represented here by these sliders, don't correspond to what we have up in the histogram. In their wisdom, Adobe for some reason have got all these completely mixed up. So if we look at the whites here as the far right edge, on the tone curve it's down as a highlight. The lights are the highlights, the darks are the shadows, and the shadows are the blacks when we look back at the original histogram. But it's not entirely like for like, because these sections are broken up by default quite equally, and up in the histogram they are not, because you've got that 5th one in the middle there. So there's a little bit of cross pollution, I guess, of each of those, but not to worry. Effectively, you know, in the middle of the image, anything to the right of that is going to be bright, anything to the left is going to be darker. Now the first thing that I tend to do, or that you should tend to do to get a natural tonality to the image in terms of adding contrast, is to raise the highlights very slightly and to pull the darks down, and you can see instantly that contrast has been added to the image and has improved the image quite considerably. What it isn't doing, because it's an S curve, it's not attacking each of those sections, those 4 sections, equally. If you look down in the bottom here, we're actually now on a curve. The darkest shadows haven't moved, but as they get brighter and brighter, then we've added in, we've pulled those shadows down slightly more and more, so it's non-linear. The same effectively for the darks and the lights, and then in the highlights, the brightest highlights haven't moved, not that there are any in this particular image, but there wouldn't be. And then as we get to the slightly duller highlights, they have been brightened more than they otherwise would have been if they were much brighter to begin with. What hasn't really changed is this middle section. I'm just going to pull that up very slightly just to get it back on the line. So this all the midtones effectively have not really changed, and that's when we can come back to the basic panel above, and we can add a little clarity, and clarity effectively adds some punch, but what it's doing is adding contrast purely to the midtones. So we've now got more punchy highlights, we've now got more punchy shadows, and we've definitely got a more punchy mid-tone area, and we haven't touched any of these sliders whatsoever. It has affected the histogram. In older versions of Lightroom, I don't think it did. I don't think the histogram moved when you played around with the tone curve down here, but now it does. But we now have a much more natural base in which to fine-tune the image. So if we can start to pull down the highlights very slightly. Now I never go much further than about 10% on these. Occasionally I'll go slightly higher. It really depends on the image. I might add in a few extra whites and boost that up slightly, but it's not making a massive difference to the image. It's just fine tuning it. Now what you don't want to do is really like pull down these highlights considerably, which I do see people doing repeatedly. What that does when you have areas of high contrast, so if you had a silhouetted tree against a bright sky and you pulled the highlights back because you really wanted to recover a lot of the sky, you would tend to find that around those high contrast areas where the branches meet the sky, where it goes black to white, or you know, dark to say a light shade of blue, you tend to start to get haloing. It doesn't really show on this particular image, but if I had a tree image where I could show you this effect, it would really stand out. You get this haloing effect throughout the image, which unfortunately really stands out, and I think really kind of spoils the aesthetic of the final image. So yeah, there we go. That's a basic introduction to the tone curve. You can have a play with it. Sometimes you end up with something, you know, all over the place like this. It really depends on the image, but essentially what you're doing is you're creating a nice contrasty but not too contrasty baseline to your image, from which you can then go on and add all your extra little bits and bobs that you want to do to edit your image to get your final vision, which is what I ended up with here. So there we go. Very simple introduction to the tone curve. Now there are lots of vlogs elsewhere on YouTube which go into the tone curve in a lot more detail, but I thought that this just might be beneficial to people who are perhaps just a little bit scared of that tone curve, not entirely sure what it does, or haven't quite mastered their editing skills in Lightroom. Okay, so, well, there you go. Till next time, have fun, keep on shooting. Boom.